Story number 1. The doll on the shelf. I never liked the doll. From the moment my daughter, Emma, unwrapped it on her 8th birthday, a chill ran down my spine. It was a gift from her great-aunt Clara, a woman known for her love of old and, frankly, unsettling antiques. The doll was no exception. A porcelain figure with glossy black curls, pale skin, and blue glass eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you went. "Oh, she's beautiful," Emma had exclaimed, her small hands cradling the doll as if it were made of glass. I forced a smile, suppressing the unease bubbling in my chest. "Her name is Annabelle," Clara said with a sly smile. "She's been in the family for generations." Something about the way she said it made my stomach twist. I didn't press further. Emma adored Annabelle, carrying her everywhere for the first few weeks. She'd prop the doll up on her bed during the day and tuck it in beside her at night. But as time passed, her fascination faded, and Annabelle found a permanent home on the shelf in her room, seated among books and stuffed animals. That's when things started to change. It began subtly small, almost imperceptible movements. I'd walk past Emma's room and notice Annabelle sitting at a slightly different angle, her head tilted just so. At first, I chalked it up to Emma adjusting her doll while playing. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Then came the nights. The first time Emma mentioned it, I was tucking her into bed. "Mom," she said, her voice small, "I think Annabelle moves when I'm sleeping." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, sweetie?" "I don't know," she said, fidgeting with the edge of her blanket. "Sometimes, when I wake up, she's not on the shelf anymore." I forced a reassuring smile. "You're probably just dreaming, Emma. Dolls don't move on their own." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded, and I kissed her forehead, promising myself I'd keep an eye on things. That night, I stayed awake, listening for anything out of the ordinary. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of old wood or the sigh of the wind against the windows. I told myself it was just a child's imagination running wild. But then I heard it, a soft thud, like something light hitting the floor, followed by the faintest sound of movement. My breath caught as I slipped out of bed, my bare feet silent against the floorboards. Emma's door was ajar, and I pushed it open slowly, peering inside. She was sound asleep, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. But Annabelle was no longer on the shelf. She was sitting on the edge of Emma's bed, her glassy blue eyes fixed on my daughter. The days that followed were a blur of escalating tension. Every night, I'd place Annabelle back on the shelf, and every morning, she'd be somewhere else on the floor, by the window, once even on the dining table downstairs. Emma became more withdrawn, her once bright smile replaced by a quiet, haunted look. "She talks to me?" she whispered one night as I tucked her in. "Who does, sweetie?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Annabelle," she said, her voice trembling. "She says things, bad things." I tried to stay calm. "What does she say?" Emma's eyes filled with tears. "She says she wants to hurt me." I couldn't ignore it any longer. The next day, while Emma was at school, I took Annabelle off the shelf and locked her in a box in the attic. The moment the door closed, a strange stillness settled over the house, as if the very air had been holding its breath. For the first time in weeks, Emma slept peacefully. I wish the story ended there. It was a week later when I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Emma, but when I went to check her room, she was sound asleep. The sound grew louder, moving down the hall toward my room. My heart pounded as I stepped into the hallway, the shadows seeming to stretch and twist in the faint light. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, from the end of the hall, I saw her, Annabelle. She stood upright, her tiny porcelain hands hanging limply at her sides, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her glass eyes gleamed in the darkness, fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I froze, unable to move, as she took a step forward. The sound of her tiny porcelain feet against the hardwood was impossibly loud. Step by step, she came closer, her head twitching slightly with each movement. And then she spoke. "You shouldn't have put me away." Her voice was high and brittle, like the sound of glass breaking, and it sent a jolt of terror through me. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and slammed the door to my room. I didn't sleep that night, clutching a kitchen knife in trembling hands as I listened to the faint sound of footsteps outside. By morning, she was gone, but the nightmare wasn't over. I found her back on the shelf in Emma's room, sitting perfectly still, her head tilted just so. Emma refused to go near her, and I couldn't blame her. I wanted to throw the doll away, but every time I tried, something stopped me, a cold, sinking dread that made my hands tremble and my breath catch. It wasn't until I finally confided in Clara that I learned the truth. "She's always been possessive," Clara said, her tone unsettlingly casual. "She doesn't like being ignored. That's how it starts, the little movements, the whispers. You should have left her alone." "What do I do now?" I demanded, my voice shaking. Clara's smile was thin and humorless. "Pray. I don't know what Annabelle wants, or why she chose us. All I know is that she's still here, watching, waiting, and every night, as I lock my bedroom door and listen to the faint sound of footsteps in the hall, I wonder how long it'll be before she's no longer content to stay on the shelf." Story number 2. The shadow that shouldn't be. There's a strange kind of stillness that comes with a snowstorm. It muffles everything, the hum of the city, the creak of old wood, even the sound of your own thoughts. I used to think of it as peaceful, but now I know better. Now I know it's not silence. It's waiting. The night it happened, the storm was at its peak. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of my little house on the edge of town. The snow fell thick and fast, blanketing the world in a cold, suffocating white. It was the kind of night where even the bravest souls stayed indoors, huddled close to their fires. I was alone, as usual. I'd moved to this house after my divorce, seeking solitude and a chance to start over. Most nights, I found comfort in the quiet, but that night, the quiet felt different, heavy, oppressive. I told myself it was just the storm. I was in the kitchen, making spaghetti, something simple to pass the time. The small overhead light cast long shadows across the room, the kind that seemed to stretch and shift with every movement. The pot on the stove began to bubble, and I turned to grab the strainer from the cupboard. That's when I saw it. The shadow was massive, far larger than anything that should have been in my house. It moved across the kitchen wall in a slow, deliberate motion, a dark, hulking form that seemed to glide rather than walk. My heart stopped. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadow disappeared as quickly as it had come, leaving the room eerily still. I spun around, expecting to see someone, something, standing behind me, but the kitchen was empty. The only sound was the faint hiss of the boiling water on the stove. My eyes darted to the windows. They were locked, the storm raging outside making it impossible for anyone to be out there. It had to be a trick of the light. That's what I told myself as I turned back to the stove, my hands trembling as I stirred the pot. But the feeling wouldn't go away, the feeling that I wasn't alone. I forced myself to eat, every bite tasting like ash as I strained to hear anything over the wind. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the siding, made my skin crawl. I kept glancing toward the kitchen wall, half expecting to see the shadow again. By the time I finished dinner, I was on edge, my nerves frayed. I checked every door, every window, making sure they were locked tight. I even went down to the basement, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating nothing but old boxes and cobwebs. There was no sign of anyone or anything in the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The hours dragged by. I tried watching TV, but the storm had knocked out the satellite. I picked up a book, but the words blurred together, my mind unable to focus. The shadow was all I could think about, how it had moved, how it had seemed almost aware. Just after midnight, I heard it, a faint rustling sound, coming from the living room. My heart leapt into my throat as I froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, louder this time, like fabric brushing against wood. Slowly, I stood and made my way to the living room, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The room was empty, the curtains were drawn, the furniture untouched, but the air felt wrong, heavy, charged, the kind of feeling you get right before a thunderstorm, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The shadow moved across the far wall, impossibly tall, its form indistinct but undeniably human. I spun toward it, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the faint outline of my own reflection in the darkened TV screen. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of the living room, clutching a fireplace poker like a lifeline, my eyes darting to every corner of the house. The storm raged on outside, the wind screaming like a living thing, but inside, the silence was worse. As dawn broke, the storm began to subside. The snow outside sparkled in the early light, untouched and pristine. I felt a small measure of relief, convinced that whatever I'd seen or thought I'd seen was gone. But then I noticed the footprints. They started at the back door, leading across the snow-covered yard and disappearing into the treeline. They were huge, far larger than any human foot, and spaced too far apart for a normal stride. My stomach turned as I realized they weren't leading away from the house. They were leading toward it. I haven't been back to that house since. I packed a bag, got in my car, and drove until the snow and the memories were far behind me. I've told myself 1,000 times that it was nothing, a trick of the light, my imagination running wild. But in the quiet moments, when the world is still, I remember the shadow, the way it moved, the way it seemed to watch me, and I know it wasn't nothing. It was waiting, and maybe, somewhere, it still is. Story number 3. The Midnight Call. It's strange how quickly you can adapt to silence. After my mom passed 5 years ago, the house grew unbearably quiet. Gone were the days of her humming in the kitchen, her voice calling out to me from the living room, or the creak of her footsteps on the stairs. At first, it felt like the walls themselves mourned her absence. But over time, I adjusted. I filled the quiet with music, with podcasts, with the low murmur of the TV, anything to keep from hearing my own thoughts. And then, one night, the silence broke. It was just past midnight, and I was in bed scrolling mindlessly through my phone. The snowstorm outside was relentless, the wind howling like a living thing, rattling the old windows. The streetlights cast a faint, flickering glow through the curtains, their light dimmed by the swirling snow. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the sudden vibration startling me. I frowned at the screen. It was a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. Normally, I'd ignore it, but something about the timing or maybe the storm made me pick up. "Hello," I said, my voice groggy. At first, there was nothing, just static, faint and crackling, like an old radio struggling to find a signal. I was about to hang up when I heard it. A voice, soft, hesitant, and achingly familiar. "Sweetheart, it's me." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was unmistakable. It was my mother. "No," I whispered, gripping the phone tighter. "This isn't possible. Who is this?" "It's me, darling," she said again, her tone so gentle, so calm. It made my chest ache. "I've missed you." My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the storm outside. "This is some kind of sick joke," I snapped, my voice trembling. "My mother is dead." There was a long pause, the static growing louder, and then she spoke again, her words chilling me to the core. "Are you alone?" I hung up, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. My first instinct was to convince myself it was a prank. some cruel twist of technology, or a stranger with a voice eerily similar to my mother's. But deep down, I knew better. The voice, the cadence, the way she said my name, it was her. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every howl of the wind outside, made me jump. I kept glancing at my phone, half expecting it to buzz again. But it stayed silent, the screen dark. The next morning, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe the storm had messed with the phone lines, creating some kind of weird interference. But when I checked my call log, there it was, a 12:03 a.m. call from a number I didn't recognize. I dialed it back, my heart hammering in my chest. The line rang once, twice, and then went to a generic voicemail message. No name, no details, just a robotic voice instructing me to leave a message after the tone. I didn't. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the unease. The call replayed in my mind constantly, her voice as clear as if she'd been standing right next to me. I started jumping at shadows, my nerves fraying with every unexplained sound in the house. But nothing happened. No calls, no strange occurrences. Slowly, I began to convince myself it had been a one-time thing, until it happened again. It was exactly a week later, just after midnight. I was in the kitchen making tea, the storm outside a near mirror of the one from the week before. My phone buzzed on the counter, and my stomach dropped when I saw the number. The same one. This time, I didn't hesitate. I answered on the first ring. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "Why are you doing this?" There was no static this time, just silence. And then, softly, the voice again. "Sweetheart, I need to see you." My blood ran cold. "Stop this, whoever you are. Just stop." "You don't believe me," she said, her tone tinged with sadness. "But you will. What do you want?" I whispered. She didn't answer. Instead, I heard something else, a faint noise in the background. It was hard to make out at first, but as I strained to listen, my heart nearly stopped. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too close. I turned around instinctively, my eyes darting to the darkened hallway leading to the living room. Empty, but the footsteps continued, echoing faintly through the phone, growing louder, closer. "Look outside," she whispered. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I'm not playing this game." "Please," she said, almost pleading. "Look." Against my better judgment, I moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer out. The snow was still falling, blanketing the yard in a pristine layer of white. And then I saw them. Footprints. They started at the edge of the forest and led directly to my front door. Fresh, deep impressions that hadn't been there moments before. "Do you believe me now?" she asked. I don't remember hanging up. I don't remember grabbing my coat or fumbling with the lock. I just remember running, the freezing air burning my lungs as I followed the footprints into the woods. They wound through the trees, the path twisting and turning, leading me deeper into the dark. Finally, they stopped. The clearing was silent, the snow undisturbed except for the trail I'd followed. No sign of anyone, no sign of her. And then my phone buzzed in my pocket. I stared at the screen, my breath fogging in the icy air. The number was the same. My hand shook as I answered. "Where are you?" I whispered. Her voice was soft, almost lost in the static. "Right behind you." I don't know how I made it out of those woods. All I remember is running, the sound of my own panicked breaths and the faint echo of her voice chasing me through the trees. I never went back to the house. Couldn't. Something followed me that night, and I'm not sure I'll ever escape it. Even now, months later, I wake up to the sound of her voice in my dreams, whispering those same words. "Are you alone?" Story number 4. The laugh in the dark. Living alone wasn't something I'd planned. When Karen left, she took more than just her things. She took the laughter, the warmth, the reason to come home at the end of the day. After the breakup, I found myself in this creaky old apartment at the edge of town. A building with paper-thin walls and ancient plumbing. It was cheap, and it was available. That was enough for me. Winter in the city was brutal. The kind of cold that gnawed at your bones and seeped into every corner of your life. Nights stretched on forever, and the wind howled like a living thing. I spent most of my evenings holed up in the apartment, reading or mindlessly scrolling through my phone. It wasn't a life, exactly, but it was what I had. And then the laughter started. It was late, maybe close to midnight, and the snow outside had turned the world into a silent, frozen wasteland. I was sitting in my worn armchair, a dog-eared paperback in my lap, when I heard it, a soft, high-pitched giggle, unmistakably coming from the next room. At first, I thought it was the neighbors. The walls in this place were like tissue paper, and I'd gotten used to the muffled sounds of conversations, arguments, and the occasional late-night party. I ignored it and kept reading. But then it came again, louder this time, a child's laugh, light and carefree, echoing through the stillness of the apartment. My stomach tightened. There were no children living in the building. I'd never seen anyone younger than 25 in the halls, let alone a kid. I set the book aside and stood, my ears straining for any other sound. The laughter stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence. I walked to the door of the next room, the guest bedroom I rarely used. My hand hovered over the knob for a moment before I turned it and stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside filtering through the slats of the blinds. Everything was as I'd left it. The bed neatly made, the dresser untouched, the air cold enough to see my breath. I checked the window. It was closed and locked, just as I remembered. Shaking my head, I went back to the living room. "It's nothing," I muttered to myself. "Just your imagination." The next night, it happened again. This time, the laughter woke me from a restless sleep. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding, the sound cutting through the quiet like a knife. It was louder now, more insistent, as if the child or whatever it was had moved closer. Grabbing the baseball bat I kept under the bed, I crept toward the guest room. The door was ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the hallway. I pushed it open with the tip of the bat and flipped on the light. Empty, but the window was open. I stood there, the cold wind biting at my face, staring at the frost-covered glass. I was certain I'd locked it before going to bed. My mind raced for an explanation. A draft? A faulty latch? But none of it made sense. The lock was stiff with age, the kind you had to forcefully twist to engage. Couldn't have just come undone. Over the next few days, the laughter grew bolder. It didn't matter if it was night or day. I'd hear it, faint and playful, as if mocking me. Sometimes it was just a single giggle. Other times a chorus of laughter that seemed to come from every corner of the apartment. I started keeping the TV on at all hours, desperate to drown out the sound. I told myself it was stress, loneliness, maybe even a touch of madness brought on by too many cold, empty nights. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. Something was in the apartment with me. The breaking point came a week later. It was another freezing night, the snow piling up outside in thick drifts. I'd barricaded myself in the living room, the only light coming from the glow of the TV. The laughter had been quiet that evening, almost subdued, and I let myself believe it was over. Then I heard the footsteps. They were light, like a child's, pattering across the hardwood floor in the hallway. My blood ran cold as I realized they were heading toward the living room. The laughter started again, soft at first, then rising to a shrill crescendo that made my skin crawl. The TV flickered and went dark, plunging the room into shadows. "Who's there?" I shouted, gripping the baseball bat like a lifeline. The only answer was another burst of laughter, this time directly behind me. I spun around, swinging the bat wildly, but there was nothing there, just the darkness pressing in on all sides, the sound of my own ragged breathing filling the air. And then I saw it. In the window, Reflected against the faint light of the street lamp outside was a figure, small and indistinct, but unmistakably there. A child, his face obscured, its body cloaked in shadows. It stood motionless, staring at me, though I couldn't see its eyes. I bolted for the door, not caring that I was barefoot and wearing nothing but pajamas. I ran into the snow-covered street, the cold burning my skin, and didn't stop until I was halfway down the block. I never went back to that apartment. I called the landlord the next day and told him I was leaving, forfeiting the deposit without a second thought. When I mentioned the laughter, he hesitated. "You're not the first," he said finally. Previous tenants said the same thing. Laughter, footsteps, things moving on their own. One woman even claimed she saw a child sitting on her bed. "What happened here?" I asked, my voice shaking. He sighed. "I don't know. Some say a boy died there years ago. Others say it's just the building. It's old. Things happen." That was the last conversation I had about it. I moved into a new place across town, a modern building with thick walls and plenty of light. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear it, the faint sound of a child's laughter, echoing through the quiet, mocking me from somewhere far away. Or maybe it's closer than I think. Story number 5. The Watcher in the Window. I moved into the little house at the edge of the forest to escape. Life in the city had grown overwhelming. Too loud, too crowded, too fast. I wanted quiet, solitude, and the kind of peace you can only find where the only noise is the wind through the trees. First, the house felt like exactly what I needed. A cozy, single-story cabin with a view of the woods, far enough from town that the nights were utterly silent. It didn't take long for that silence to turn oppressive. It started with the feeling, you know, the one, that subtle, prickling awareness at the back of your neck, like you're being watched. First, I brushed it off as paranoia. Living alone for the first time in years can do that to you. But as the days went on, the feeling grew stronger, more insistent. I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was never anyone, just the shadows. And the window. The living room was my favorite spot in the house, with its big, old-fashioned bay window that let in the golden light of the afternoon sun. At night, though, it became a black mirror, reflecting the room back at me in eerie detail. I took to drawing the curtains as soon as the sun went down, but I couldn't shake the sensation that someone, was out there, just beyond the glass. One night, it happened. I was curled up on the couch, a mug of tea in hand, a rerun of some forgettable sitcom playing softly on the TV. The curtains were drawn, but they didn't quite meet in the middle, leaving a narrow strip of darkness visible through the glass. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow, person, standing still, their silhouette framed against the snowy backdrop of the forest. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, staring at the figure. My rational mind tried to reason it away. A trick of the light, the reflection of something inside the house. But as I watched, the shadow moved. It wasn't much, just the smallest shift of weight, a subtle sway that made my stomach twist in fear. I wanted to get up, to check the locks, to do something, but I couldn't make my body move. My tea went cold in my hands as I sat there, locked in a silent standoff with the darkness beyond the glass. After what felt like an eternity, I blinked, and the shadow was gone. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. I went to bed with every light in the house on, my nerves frayed and my thoughts racing. The next morning, the snow had stopped, leaving the world blanketed in pristine white. I tried to shake off the memory of the night before, convincing myself that I'd overreacted. But as I stepped outside to get the mail, I saw them, footprints. They started just outside the living room window. The snow crushed into deep, deliberate impressions that trailed off toward the forest. The prints were too large to be mine, and the distance between each step was impossibly long, as if whoever or whatever had made them wasn't walking so much as gliding. I stood there, staring at the tracks, my breath fogging in the icy air. The forest loomed dark and silent, the bare branches of the trees reaching out like skeletal fingers. I thought about following the tracks but stopped myself. Every instinct screamed that I didn't want to know where they led. That night, I didn't bother with the TV. I locked the doors, pulled the curtains tight, and sat in the middle of the living room with a baseball bat in my lap. The hours dragged on, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling. I told myself it was nothing, just the cold, the isolation, the tricks your mind plays when you're alone. And then I heard it, a faint tap, tap, tap against the glass. It was so soft I almost convinced myself I hadn't heard it. But then it came again, more insistent this time. My throat tightened as I slowly turned to face the window. The curtains were still drawn, but I could see the faint outline of a shape on the other side, pressed close against the glass. The tapping stopped, replaced by a sound that sent a jolt of terror through me. The slow, deliberate scrape of fingernails on the window pane. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I just sat there, clutching the bat, my eyes locked on the curtain. And then, as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. I don't remember falling asleep. I must have, though, because I woke the next morning to weak sunlight filtering through the curtains. The baseball bat was still in my lap, my hands stiff and sore from gripping it all night, summoning every ounce of courage I had. I stepped outside. The snow around the window was undisturbed, as if no one had been there. But as I looked closer, I saw it, faint, icy streaks running down the glass, as though something or someone had pressed their fingers against it and dragged them downward. I didn't stay in the house after that. I packed a bag and left, moving into a motel in town while I figured out what to do next. When I told the owner of the property what had happened, she went pale. "You're not the first," she said quietly. "The last tenant left after just a month. Same reason." I asked her if she knew what was out there, but she just shook her head. "Nobody does. But if I were you, I'd stay away from the woods." I didn't need to be told twice. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear that faint tapping in my dreams, the slow scrape of nails against glass. And in those moments, I wonder if I really left it behind or if it's still watching, waiting for the chance to follow.